A Night in Whitechapel. My friend Ledantec and I were 25, and we had come to London for the first time in our lives. It was a Saturday evening in December, cold and foggy, and I think that all that combined is more than enough to explain why my friend Ledantec and I were most abominably drunk, though, to tell the truth, we did not feel any discomfort from it. On the contrary, we were floating in an atmosphere of perfect bliss. We did not speak, certainly, for we were incapable of doing so. But then we had no inclination for conversation. What would be the good of it? We could so easily read all our thoughts in each other's eyes. And all our thoughts consisted in the sweet and unique knowledge that we were thinking about nothing whatever. It was not, however, in order to arrive at that state of delicious intellectual nihility that we had gone to mysterious Whitechapel. We had gone into the first public house we saw, with the firm intention of studying manners and customs, not to mention morals, there as spectators, artists, and philosophers. But in the second public house we entered, we ourselves became like the objects of our investigations, that is to say, sponges soaked in alcohol. Between one public house and the other, the outer air seemed to squeeze those sponges, which then got just as dry as before. And thus we rolled from public house to public house, until at last the sponges could not hold any more. Consequently, we had for some time bidden farewell to our studies in morals, and now they were limited to two impressions: zigzags through the darkness outside, and a gleam of light outside the public houses. As to the inhibition of brandies, whiskies, and gins, that was done mechanically, and our stomachs scarcely noticed it. But what strange beings we had elbowed with during our long stoppages! What a number of faces to be remembered! What clothes, what attitudes, what talk, and what rags! At first we tried to note them exactly in our memory, but there were so many of them, and our brain got mixed so quickly, that at present we had no very clear recollection of anything or anybody. Even objects that were immediately before us appeared to us in a vague, dusky phantasmagoria, and got confounded with precious objects in an inextricable manner. The world became a sort of kaleidoscope to us, seen in a dream through the penumbra of an aquarium. Suddenly we were aroused from this state of somnolence, awakened as if by a blow in the chest, and imperiously forced to fix our attention on what we saw, for amidst this whirl of strange sights, one stranger than all attracted our eyes, and seemed to say to us, "Look at me." It was at the open door of a public house. A ray of light streamed into the street through the half-open door, and that brutal ray fell right onto the spectre that had just risen up there, dumb and motionless. For it was indeed a spectre, pitiful and terrible, and above all, most real, as it stood out boldly against the dark background of the street, which it made darker still behind it. Young, yes, the woman was certainly young. There could be no doubt about that, when one looked at her smooth skin, her smiling mouth, which showed her white teeth, and firm bust, which could be plainly noted under her thin dress. But then how explain her perfectly white hair, not gray or growing gray, but absolutely white as any octogenarian's? And then her eyes beneath her smooth brow were surely the eyes of an old woman. Certainly they were, and of a woman one could not tell how old. For it must have taken years of trouble and sorrow, of tears and of sleepless nights, and a whole long existence thus to dull, to wear out, and to roughen those vitreous pupils. Vitreous? Not exactly that, for roughened glass still retains a dull and milky brightness, a recollection, as it were, of its former transparency. But her eyes seemed rather to have been made of metal, which had turned rusty. And really, if pewter could rust, I should have compared them to pewter covered with rust. They had the dead color of pewter, and at the same time they emitted a glance which was the color of reddish water. But it was not until some time later that I tried to define them thus approximately by retrospective analysis. At that moment, being altogether incapable of such an effort, I could only establish in my own mind the idea of extreme decrepitude and horrible old age, which they produced in my imagination. Have I said that they were set in very puffy eyelids, which had no lashes whatever, and on her forehead without wrinkles there was not a vestige of eyebrow? When I tell you this, and considering their dull look beneath the hair of an octogenarian, it is not surprising that Ledantec and I said in a low voice at the sight of this woman, who was evidently young, "Oh, poor, poor old woman!" Her great age was further accentuated by the terrible poverty that was revealed by her dress. If she had been better dressed, her youthful looks would perhaps have struck us more, but her thin shawl, which was all that she had over her chemise, her single petticoat, which was full of holes and almost in rags, and which did not nearly reach to her bare feet, her straw hat, with ragged feathers and with ribbons of no particular color through age, it all seemed so ancient, so prodigiously antique. From what remote, superannuated, abolished period did they all spring? One did not venture to guess, and by a perfectly natural association of ideas, one seemed to infer that the unfortunate creature herself was as old as her clothes were. Now, by one, I mean by Ledantec and myself. That is to say, by two men who were abominably drunk and who were arguing with the special logic of intoxication. It was also under the softening influence of alcohol that we looked at the vague smile on those lips with the teeth of a child, without stopping to reflect on the beauty of those youthful teeth, and seeing nothing except her fixed and almost idiotic smile, which no longer contrasted with the dull expression of her looks, but, on the contrary, strengthened them. For, in spite of her teeth, it was the smile of an old woman in our imagination, and as for me, I was really pleased at the thought of being so acute, when I inferred that this grandmother, with such pale lips, had the set of teeth of a young girl. And still, thanks to the softening influence of alcohol, I was not angry with her for this artifice. I even thought it particularly praiseworthy, since, after all, the poor creature thus carried out her calling conscientiously, which was to seduce us. For there was no possible doubt about the matter that this grandmother was nothing more nor less than a prostitute. And then drunk, horribly drunk, much more drunk than Ledantec and I were, for we really could manage to say, "Oh, pity the poor, poor old woman," while she was incapable of articulating a single syllable, of making a gesture, or even of imparting a gleam of promise, a furtive flash of allurement to her eyes. With her hands crossed on her stomach, and resting against the front of the public house, with her whole body as stiff as if she had been in a state of catalepsy, she had nothing alluring about her except her sad smile, and that inspired us with all the more pity, because she was even more drunk than we were, and so, by identical spontaneous movement, we, each of us, seized her by an arm, to take her into the public house with us. To our great astonishment, she resisted, sprang back, and so was in the shadow again, out of the ray of light which came through the door, while at the same time she began to walk through the darkness, and to drag us with her, for she was clinging to our arms. We followed her without speaking and without knowing where we were going, but without the least uneasiness on that score. Only when she suddenly burst into violent sobs as she walked, Ledantec and I began to sob in unison. The cold and the fog had suddenly congested our brains again, and we had again lost all precise consciousness of our acts, of our thoughts, and of our sensations. Our sobs had nothing of grief in them, but we were floating in an atmosphere of perfect bliss, and I can remember that at that moment it was no longer the exterior world which seemed to me as if I were looking at it through the penumbra of an aquarium. It was I myself, an I composed of three, which was changing into something that was floating adrift in something, though what it was I did not know, composed of palpable fog and intangible water, and it was exquisitely delightful. From that moment I remember nothing more until what follows, and which had the effect of a clap of thunder on me, and made me rise up from the bottom of the depth to which I had descended. Ledantec was standing in front of me, his face convulsed with horror, his hair standing on end, and his eyes staring out of his head, and he shouted to me, "Let us escape! Let us escape!" Whereupon I opened my eyes wide, and found myself lying on the ground, in a room into which daylight was shining. I saw some rags hanging against the wall, 2 chairs, a broken jug lying on the floor by my side, and in a corner a wretched bed on which a woman was lying, who was no doubt dead, for her head was hanging over the side, and her long white hair reached almost to my feet. With a bound I was up, like Ledantec. "What?" I said to him, while my teeth chattered. "Did you kill her?" "No, no," he replied, "but that makes no difference. Let us be off." I felt completely sober by that time, but I did think that he was still suffering somewhat from the effects of last night's drunk. Otherwise, why should he wish to escape, while the remains of pity for the unfortunate woman forced me to stay? What is the matter with her? If she is ill, we must look after her. And I went to the wretched bed in order to put her head back on the pillow, but I discovered that she was neither dead nor ill, but only sound asleep. And I also noticed that she was quite young. She still wore that idiotic smile, but her teeth were her own and those of a girl. Her smooth skin and her firm bust showed that she was not more than 16, perhaps not so much. "There, you see it, you can see it," Ledantec said. "Let us be off." He tried to drag me out, and he was still drunk. I could see it by his feverish movements, his trembling hands, and his nervous looks. Then he implored me and said, "I slept beside the old woman, but she is not old. Look at her, look at her. Yes, she is old after all." And he lifted up her long hair by handfuls. It was like handfuls of white silk. And then he added, evidently in a sort of delirium, which made me fear an attack of delirium tremens, "To think that I have begotten children, 3, 4 children, who knows how many children, all in one night, and they were born immediately, and have grown up already. Let us be off." Decidedly it was an attack of madness. Poor Ledantec! What could I do for him? I took his arm and tried to calm him, but he thought that I was going to try and make him go to bed with her again, and he pushed me away and exclaimed with tears in his voice, "If you do not believe me, look under the bed. The children are there. They are there, I tell you. Look here, just look here." He threw himself down, flat on his stomach, and actually pulled out 1, 2, 3, 4 children, who had hidden under the bed. I do not exactly know whether they were boys or girls, but all, like the sleeping woman, had white hair, the hair of an octogenarian. Was I still drunk, like Ledantec, or was I mad? What was the meaning of this strange hallucination? I hesitated for a moment and shook myself to be sure that it was I. No, no, I had all my wits about me, and I, in reality, saw that horrible lot of little brats. They had all their faces in their hands, and were crying and squalling. And then, suddenly, one of them jumped onto the bed. All the others followed his example, and the woman woke up. And then we stood, while those 5 pairs of eyes without eyebrows or eyelashes, eyes with the dull color of pewter, and whose pupils had the color of red water, were steadily fixed on us. "Let us be off! Let us be off!" Ledantec repeated, leaving go of me. And at that time I paid attention to what he said, and after throwing some small change onto the floor, I followed him to make him understand, when he should be quite sober, that he saw before him a poor albino prostitute who had several brothers and sisters. End of section 19. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 20 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Countess Satan. 1. They were discussing dynamite, the social revolution, nihilism, and even those who cared least about politics had something to say. Some were alarmed, others philosophized, while others again tried to smile. "Bah," N said, "when we are all blown up, we shall see what it is like. Perhaps, after all, it may be an amusing situation, provided one goes high enough." "But we shall not be blown up at all," G. the optimist said, interrupting him. "It is all a romance." "You are mistaken, my dear fellow," Jules de C. replied. "It is like a romance, but with that confounded nihilism, everything seems like one. But it would be a mistake to trust it. Thus, I myself, the manner in which I made Bakounine's acquaintance." They knew that he was a good narrator, and it was no secret that his life had been an adventurous one. So they drew closer to him and listened religiously. This is what he told them. 2. I met Countess Nioska W., that strange woman who was usually called Countess Satan, in Naples. I immediately attached myself to her out of curiosity, and I soon fell in love with her. Not that she was beautiful, for she was a Russian who had all the bad characteristics of the Russian type. She was thin and squat at the same time, while her face was sallow and puffy, with high cheekbones and a Cossack's nose. But her conversation bewitched everyone. She was many-sided, learned, a philosopher, scientifically depraved, satanic. Perhaps the word is rather pretentious, but it exactly expresses what I want to say. For in other words, she loved evil for the sake of evil. She rejoiced in other people's vices, and liked to sow the seeds of evil in order to see it flourish, and that on a fraud, on an enormous scale. It was not enough for her to corrupt individuals. She only did that to keep her hand in. What she wished to do was to corrupt the masses. By slightly altering it after her own fashion, she might have adopted the famous saying of Caligula. She also wished that the whole human race had but one head, but not in order that she might cut it off, but that she might make the philosophy of nihility flourish there. What a temptation to become the lord and master of such a monster! And I allowed myself to be tempted, and undertook the adventure. The means came unsought for by me, and the only thing that I had to do was to show myself more perverted and satanical than she was herself, and so I played the devil. "Yes," I said, "we writers are the best workmen for doing evil, as our books may be bottles of poison. The so-called men of action only turn the handle of the mitrailleuse which we have loaded. Formulas will destroy the world, and it is we who invent them." "That is true," she said, "and that is what is wanting in Bakounine, I am sorry to say." That name was constantly in her mouth, and so I asked her for details, which she gave me, as she knew the man intimately. "After all," she said, with a contemptuous grimace, "he is only a kind of Garibaldi." She told me, although she made fun of him as she did so, about his Odyssey of the Barricades, and of the hulks which made up Bakunin's legend, and which is, nevertheless, only the exact truth, his part of chief of the insurgents at Prague and then at Dresden, his first death sentence, about his imprisonment at Olmütz and in the casemates of the fortress of St. Peter and St. Paul, in a subterranean dungeon at Schusselburg, about his exile to Siberia and his wonderful escape down the river Amur on a Japanese coasting vessel by way of Yokohama and San Francisco, and about his final arrival in London, whence he was directing all the operations of nihilism. "You see," she said, "he is a thorough adventurer, and now all his adventures are over. He got married at Tobolsk and became a mere respectable middle-class man. And then he has no individual ideas. Herzen, the pamphleteer of Kolokol, inspired him with the only fertile phrase that he ever uttered, 'Land and liberty.' But that is not yet the definite formula, the general formula, what I will call the dynamite formula. At best, Bakunin would become an incendiary and burn down cities. And what is that, I ask you? Bah! A second-hand Rostopchine. He wants a prompter, and I offered to become his, but he did not take me seriously." It would be useless to enter into all the psychological details which mark the course of my passion for the Countess, and to explain to you more fully the attraction of curiosity which she offered me more and more every day. It was getting exasperating, and the more so as she resisted me as stoutly as the shyest of innocents could have done. But at the end of a month of mad Satanism, I saw what her game was. Do you know what she had thought of? She meant to make me Bakunin's prompter, or at any rate that is what she said. But no doubt she reserved the right to herself, and that is how I understood her, to prompt the prompter. And my passion for her, which she purposely left unsatisfied, assured her that absolute power over me. All this may appear madness to you, but it is, nevertheless, the exact truth, and in short, one morning she bluntly made the offer: "Become Bakunin's soul, and you shall have me." Of course I accepted, for it was too fantastically strange to refuse. Do you think so? What an adventure! What luck! A number of letters between the Countess and Bakunin prepared the way. I was introduced to him at his house, and they discussed me there. I became a sort of Western prophet, a mystic charmer who was ready to annihilate the Latin races, the St. Paul of the new religion of nothingness. And at last a day was fixed for us to meet in London. He lived in a small one-storied house in Pimlico, with a tiny garden in front, and nothing noticeable about it. We were first of all shown into the commonplace parlor of all English homes, and then upstairs. The room where the Countess and I were left was small and very badly furnished, with a square table, with writing materials on it in the middle. That was his sanctuary. The deity soon appeared, and I saw him in flesh and bone, especially in flesh, for he was enormously stout. His broad face, with prominent cheekbones in spite of the fat, and with a nose like a double funnel, with small sharp eyes which had a magnetic look, proclaimed the Tartar, the old Turanian blood, which produced the Attilas, the Genghis Khans, the Tamerlanes. The obesity, which is characteristic of the nomad races, who are always on horseback or driving, added to his Asiatic look. The man was certainly not a European, a slave, a descendant of the deistic Aryans, but a descendant of the atheistic hordes who had several times already almost overrun Europe, and who, instead of any ideas of progress, have the belief in nihility at the bottom of their hearts. I was astonished, for I had not expected that the majesty of a whole race could be thus revived in a man, and my stupefaction increased after an hour's conversation. I could quite understand why such a colossus had not wished for the Countess as his Egeria. She was a mere silly child to have dreamt of acting such a part to such a thinker. She had not felt the profoundness of that horrible philosophy which was hidden under that material activity, nor had she seen the profit under that man of the barricades. Or perhaps he had not thought it advisable to reveal himself to her like that. But he revealed himself to me, and inspired me with terror. A prophet? Oh, yes. He thought himself an Attila, and foresaw the consequences of his revolution. It was not only from instinct, but also from theory, that he urged a nation on to nihilism. The phrase is not his, but Turgenev's, I believe, but the idea certainly belongs to him. He got his program of agricultural communism from Herzen, and his destructive radicalism from Pugachev, but he did not stop there. I mean that he went on to evil for the sake of evil. Herzen wished for the happiness of the Slav peasant. Pugachev wanted to be elected emperor, but all that Bakunin wanted was to overthrow the actual order of things, no matter by what means, and to replace social concentration by a universal upheaval. It was the dream of a Tartar. It was true nihilism pushed to extreme practical conclusions. It was, in a word, the applied philosophy of chance, the indeterminatism of anarchy. Monstrous it may be, but grand in its monstrosity. And you must note that the man of action who was so despised by the Countess discovered in Bakunin the gigantic dreamer whom I have just shown you. And his dream did not remain a dream, but began to be realized. It was by the care of that organizer that the nihilistic party assumed a body. A party in which there is a little of everything, you know, but on the whole a formidable party, on account of the advanced guard in true nihilism, whose object is nothing less than to destroy the Western world, to see it blossom from under the ruins of a general dispersion, which is the last conception of modern Tartarism. I never saw Bakunin again, for the Countess's conquest would have been too dearly bought by any attempt to act a comedy with this old man of the mountains. And besides that, after this visit, poor Countess Satan appeared to me quite silly. Her famous Satanism was nothing but the flicker of a spirit lamp after the general conflagration of which the other had dreamt, and she had certainly shown herself very silly when she could not understand that prodigious monster. And as she had seduced me only by her intellect and her perversity, I was disgusted as soon as she laid aside that mask. I left her without telling her of my intention, and never saw her again either. No doubt they both took me for a spy from the third section of the Imperial Chancellery. In that case they must have thought me very strong to have resisted, and all I have to do is to look out if any affiliated members of their society recognize me. 3. Then he smiled, and turning to the waiter, who had just come in, he said, "Meanwhile, open us another bottle of champagne, and make the cork pop. It will, at any rate, somewhat accustom us to the day when we shall all be blown up with dynamite ourselves." End of section 20. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 21 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Kind girls. Every Friday, regularly, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, he came into the courtyard, put down his soft hat at his feet, struck a few chords on his guitar, and then began a ballad in his full, rich voice. And soon, at every window in the four sides of that dull, barrack-like building, some girls appeared, one in an elegant dressing gown, another in a little jacket, most of them with their breasts and arms bare, all of them just out of bed, with their hair hastily twisted up, their eyes blinking in the sudden blaze of sunlight, their complexions dull, and their eyes still heavy from want of sleep. They swayed themselves backwards and forwards to his slow melody, and gave themselves up to the enjoyment of it, and coppers and even silver poured into the handsome singer's hat, and more than one of them would have liked to have followed the penny which she threw to him, and to have gone with the singer who had the voice of a siren, and who seemed to say to all these amorous girls, "Come, come to my retreat, where you will find a palace of crystal and gold, and wreaths which are always fresh, and happiness and love which never die." That was what they seemed to hear, those unhappy girls, when they heard him sing the songs of the old legends, which they had formerly believed. That was what they understood by the foolish words of the ballad. Then and nothing else, for how could anyone doubt it, on seeing the fresh roses on their cheeks, and the tender flame which flickered like a mystic night light in their eyes, which had, for the moment, become the eyes of innocent young girls again, but of young girls who had grown up very quickly, alas! Who were very precocious, and who very soon became the women that they were, poor vendors of love, always in search of love for which they were paid. That was why, when he had finished his second ballad, and sometimes even sooner, concupiscent looks appeared in their eyes. The boatman of their dreams, the water sprite of fairy tales, vanished in the mist of their childish recollections, and the singer reassumed his real shape, that of musician and strolling player, whom they wished to pay to be their lover. And the coppers and small silver were showered on him again, with engaging smiles, with the leers of a street walker, even with "Pst! Pst!" which soon transformed the barrack-like courtyard into an enormous cage full of twittering birds, while some of them could not restrain themselves, but said aloud, rolling their eyes with desire, "How handsome the creature is! Good heavens, how handsome he is!" He was really handsome, and nobody could deny it, and even too handsome, with a regular beauty which almost palled on people. He had large, almond-shaped, gentle eyes, a Grecian nose, a bow-shaped mouth, hidden by a heavy moustache, and long, black, curly hair. In short, a head fit to be put into a hairdresser's window, or, better still, perhaps, onto the front page of the ballads which he was singing. But what made him still handsomer was that his self-conceit had a look of sovereign indifference, for he was not satisfied with not replying to the smiles, the ogles, and the pst psts, by taking no notice of them. But when he had finished, he shrugged his shoulders, he winked mischievously, and turned his lips contemptuously, which said very clearly, "The stove is not being heated for you, my little kittens." Often one might have thought that he expressly wished to show his contempt, and that he tried to make himself thought unpoetical in the eyes of all those amorous girls, and to check their love, for he cleared his throat ostentatiously and offensively, more than was necessary after singing, as if he would have liked to spit at them. But all that did not make him unpoetical in their eyes, and many of them, most of them, who were absolutely mad on him, went so far as to say that he did it like a swell. The girl who, in her enthusiasm, had been the first to utter that exclamation of intense passion, and who, after throwing him small silver, had thrown him a 20-franc gold piece, at last made up her mind to have an explanation. Instead of a "Pst! Pst!" she spoke to him boldly one morning, in the presence of all the others, who religiously held their tongues. "Come up here," she called out to him, and from habit she added, "I will be very nice, you handsome, dark fellow." At first they were dumbfounded at her audacity, and then all their cheeks flushed with jealousy, and the flame of mad desire shot from their eyes. From every window there came a perfect torrent of "Yes, Come up, come up. Don't go to her, come to me." And meanwhile there was a shower of halfpence, of francs, of gold coins, as well as of cigars and oranges, while lace pocket handkerchiefs, silk neckties, and scarves fluttered in the air and fell round the singer like a flight of many-colored butterflies. He picked up the spoil calmly, almost carelessly, stuffed the money into his pocket, made a bundle of the furbelows, which he tied up as if they had been soiled linen, and then, raising himself up, and putting his felt hat on his head, he said, "Thank you, ladies, but indeed I cannot." They thought that he did not know how to satisfy so many demands at once, and one of them said, "Let him choose." "Yes, yes, that is it," they all exclaimed unanimously. But he repeated, "I tell you I cannot." They thought he was excusing himself out of gallantry, and several of them exclaimed, almost with tears of emotion, "Women are all heart," and the same voice that had spoken before, it was one of the girls who wished to settle the matter amicably, said, "We must draw lots." "Yes, yes, that is it," they all cried, and again there was a religious silence, more religious than before, for it was caused by anxiety, and the beatings of their hearts may have been heard. The singer profited by it to say slowly, "I cannot have that either, nor all of you at once, nor one after the other, nothing. I tell you that I cannot." "Why? Why?" And now they were almost screaming, for they were angry and sorry at the same time. Their cheeks had gone from scarlet to livid, their eyes flashed fire, and some shook their fists menacingly. "Silence!" the girl cried, who had spoken first. "Be quiet, you pack of hussies! Let him explain himself, and tell us why." "Yes, yes, let us be quiet. Make him explain himself in God's name." Then, in the fierce silence that ensued, the singer said, opening his arms wide, with a gesture of despairing inability to do what they wanted, "What do you want? It is very amusing, but I cannot do more. I have 2 girls of my own already at home." Section 21. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 22 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Profitable business. He certainly did not think himself a saint, nor had he any hypocritical pretensions to virtue, but nevertheless he thought as highly of himself as much as he did of anybody else, and perhaps even a trifle more highly, and that quite impartially, without any more self-love than was necessary, and without having to accuse himself of being self-conceited. He did himself justice, that was all, for he had good moral principles, and he applied them, especially if the truth must be told, not only to judging the conduct of others, but also, it must be allowed, in a measure for regulating his own conduct, as he would have been very vexed if he had been able to think of himself, "On the whole, I am what people call a perfectly honorable man." Luckily, he had never, oh, never, been obliged to doubt that excellent opinion which he had of himself, which he liked to express thus, in his moments of rhetorical expansion: "My whole life gives me the right to shake hands with myself." Perhaps a subtle psychologist would have found some flaws in this armor of integrity, which was sanctimoniously satisfied with itself. It was, for example, quite certain that our friend had no scruples in making profit out of the vices or misfortunes of his neighbors, provided that he was not, in his own opinion, the person who was solely or chiefly responsible for them. But, on the whole, it was only one manner of looking at it, nothing more, and there were plenty of materials for casuistic arguments in it. This kind of discussion is particularly unpleasant to such simple natures as that of his worthy fellow, who would have replied to the psychologist, "Why go on a wild goose chase? As for me, I am perfectly sincere." You must not, however, believe that this perfect sincerity prevented him from having elevated views. He prided himself on having a weakness for imagination and the unforeseen, and if he would have been offended at being called a dishonorable man, he would perhaps have been still more hurt if anybody had attributed middle-class tastes to him. Accordingly, in love affairs, he expressed a most virtuous horror of adultery, for if he had committed it, it would not have been able to bear that testimony to himself, which was so sweet to his conscience. Ah! As for me, I can declare that I never wronged anybody. While, on the other hand, he was not satisfied with pleasure which was paid for by the hour, and which debases the noblest desires of the heart to the vulgar satisfaction of a physical requirement. What he required, so he used to say, while lifting his eyes up to heaven, was something rather more ideal than that. That search after the ideal did not, indeed, cost him any great effort, as it was limited to not going to licensed houses of ill fame, and to not accosting street walkers with the simple words, "How much?" It consisted chiefly in wishing to be gallant even with such women, and in trying to persuade himself that they liked him for his own sake, and in preferring those whose manner, dress, and looks allowed room for suppositions and romantic illusions, such as, "She might be taken for a little work girl who has not yet lost her virtue." "No, I rather think she is a widow who has met with misfortunes." "What if she be a fashionable lady in disguise?" And other nonsense, which he knew to be such even while imagining it, but whose imaginary flavor was very pleasant to him all the same. With such tastes, it was only natural that this pilgrim followed and pushed up against women in the large shops, and whenever there was a crowd, and that he especially looked out for those ladies of easy virtue, for nothing is more exciting than those half-closed shutters, behind which a face is indistinctly seen, and from which one hears a furtive "Psst, psst." He used to say to himself, "Who is she? Is she young and pretty? Is she some old woman who is terribly skilful at her business, but who yet does not venture to show herself any longer? Or is she some new beginner who has not yet acquired the boldness of an old hand? In any case, it is the unknown, perhaps, that is my ideal during the time it takes me to find my way upstairs." And always, as he went up, his heart beat, as it does at a first meeting with a beloved mistress. But he had never felt such a delicious shiver as he did on the day on which he penetrated into that old house in the blind alley in Ménilmontant. He could not have said why, for he had often gone after so-called love in much stranger places. But now, without any reason, he had a presentiment that he was going to meet with an adventure, and that gave him a delightful sensation. The woman who had made the sign to him lived on the third floor, and all the way upstairs his excitement increased, until his heart was beating violently when he reached the landing. At the same time he was going up, he smelt a peculiar odor, which grew stronger and stronger, and which he had tried in vain to analyze, though all he could arrive at was, that it smelt like a chemist's shop. The door on the right, at the end of the passage, was opened as soon as he put his foot on the landing, and the woman said in a low voice, "Come in, my dear." A whiff of a very strong smell met his nostrils through the open door, and suddenly he exclaimed, "How stupid I was! I know what it is now. It is carbolic acid, is it not?" "Yes," the woman replied. "Don't you like it, dear? It is very wholesome, you know." The woman was not ugly, although not young. She had very good eyes, although they were sad and sunken in her head. Evidently she had been crying, very much quite recently, and that imparted a special spice to the vague smile which she put on, so as to appear more amiable. Seized by his romantic ideas once more, and under the influence of the presentiment which he had had just before, he thought, and the idea filled him with pleasure, "She is some widow whom poverty has forced to sell herself." The room was small, but very clean and tidy, and that confirmed him in his conjecture. As he was curious to verify its truth, he went into the 3 rooms which opened into one another. The bedroom came first. Next there came a kind of a drawing room, and then a dining room, which evidently served as a kitchen, for a Dutch tiled stove stood in the middle of it, on which a stew was simmering. But the smell of carbolic acid was even stronger in that room. He remarked on it, and added with a laugh, "Do you put it with your soup?" And as he said this, he laid hold of the handle of the door which led into the next room, for he wanted to see everything, even that nook which was apparently a store cupboard. But the woman seized him by the arm and pulled him violently back. "No, no," she said, almost in a whisper, and in a hoarse and suppliant voice, "No, dear, not there, not there. You must not go in there." "Why?" he said, for his wish to go in had only become stronger. "Because if you go in there, you will have no inclination to remain with me, and I so want you to stay, if you only knew." "Well, what?" And with a violent movement, he opened the glazed door, when the smell of carbolic acid seemed almost to strike him in the face. But what he saw made him recoil still more, for on a small iron bedstead lay the dead body of a woman fantastically illuminated by a single wax candle, and in horror he turned to make his escape. "Stop, my dear!" the woman sobbed, and clinging to him, she told him amidst a flood of tears that her friend had died 2 days previously, and that there was no money to bury her. "Because," she said, "you can understand that I want it to be a respectable funeral. We were so very fond of each other. Stop here, my dear, do stop. I only want 10 francs more. Don't go away." They had gone back into the bedroom, and she was pushing him towards the bed. "No," he said, "let me go. I will give you the 10 francs, but I will not stay here. I cannot." He took his purse out of his pocket, extracted a 10-franc piece, put it on the table, and then went to the door. But when he had reached it, a thought suddenly struck him, as if somebody were reasoning with him without his knowledge. Why lose these 10 francs? Why not profit by this woman's good intentions? She certainly did her business bravely, and if I had not known about the matter, I should certainly not have gone away for some time. Well, then? But other obscure suggestions whispered to him. She was her friend. They were so fond of each other. Was it friendship or love? Oh, love, apparently. Well, it would surely be avenging morality if this woman were forced to be faithless to that monstrous love. And suddenly the man turned around and said in a low and trembling voice, "Look here, if I give you 20 francs instead of 10, I suppose you could buy some flowers for her as well?" The unhappy woman's face brightened with pleasure and gratitude. "Will you really give me 20? "Yes," he replied, "and more, perhaps. It quite depends upon yourself." And with the quiet conscience of an honorable man, who, at the same time, is not a fool, he said gravely, "You need only be very complaisant." And he added mentally, "Especially as I deserve it, as in giving you 20 francs, I am performing a good action." End of section 22. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 23 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Violated. "Really?" Paul repeated. "Really?" "Yes. I, who am here before you, have been violated, and violated by— But if I were to tell you immediately by whom, there would be no story, eh? And as you want a story, eh? And as you want a story, I will tell you all about it from beginning to end, and I shall begin at the beginning. I had been shooting over the wasteland in the heart of Brittany for a week, which borders on the Black Mountain. It is a desolate and wild country, but it abounds in game. One can walk for hours without meeting a human being, and when one meets anybody, it is just the same as if one had not, for the people are absolutely ignorant of French. And when I got to an inn at night, I had to employ signs to let the people know that I wanted supper and bed. As I happened to be in a melancholy frame of mind at the time, that solitude delighted me, and my dog's companionship was quite enough for me. And so you may guess my irritation when I perceived one morning that I was being followed, absolutely followed, by another sportsman who seemed to wish to enter into conversation with me. The day before, I had already noticed him obstructing the horizon several times, and I had attributed it to the chances of sport, which brought us both to the same likely spots for game. But now I could not be mistaken. The fellow was evidently following me, and was stretching his little pair of compasses as much as he could, so as to keep up with my long strides, and took short cuts so as to catch me up at the half circle. As he seemed bent upon the matter, I naturally grew obstinate also, and he spent his whole day in trying to catch me up, while I spent mine in trying to baffle him. And we seemed to be playing at hide and seek. The consequences were that when it was getting dark, I had completely lost myself in the most deserted part of the moor. There was no cottage near, and not even a church spire in the distance. The only landmark was the hateful outline of that cursed man about 500 yards off. Of course, he had won the game. I should have to put a good face on the matter, and allow him to join me, or rather I should have to join him myself, if I did not wish to sleep in the open air, and with an empty stomach. And so I went up to him, and asked my way in a half surly manner. He replied very affably that there was no inn in the neighborhood, as the nearest village was 5 leagues off, but that he lived only about an hour's walk off, and that he considered himself very fortunate in being able to offer me hospitality. I was utterly done up, and how could I refuse? So we went off through the heather and furze, I walking slowly because I was so tired, and he went tripping along merrily with his legs like a basset hound's, which seemed untirable. And yet he was an old man, and not strongly built, for I could have knocked him over by blowing on him. But how he could walk, the beast! But he was not a troublesome companion, as I imagined he would have been, and he did not at all seem to wish to enter into conversation with me, as I feared he would. When he had given his invitation, and I had accepted it and thanked him in a few words, he did not open his lips again, and we walked on in silence, and only his glances worried me, for I felt them on me, as if he wished to force me into an intimacy, which my closed lips refused. But on the whole, his tenacious looks, which I noticed furtively, appeared sympathetic and even admiring. Yes, really admiring. But I could not give him as good as he brought, for he was certainly not handsome. His legs were short and rather bandy, and he was thin and narrow-chested. His face was like a bit of parchment, furrowed and wrinkled, without a hair on it to hide the folds in his skin. His hair resembled that of an ignorantine brother, with its gray locks falling onto his greasy collar. He had a nose like a ferret, and rat's eyes, but he was able to offer me food and quarters for the night, and it was not requisite that he should be handsome in order to do that. Capital food and very comfortable quarters, a manorial dwelling, a real old, well-furnished manor house, and in the large dining room, in front of the huge fireplace, where a large fire was blazing, dinner was laid. I will say no more than that. A hotch-potch, which had been stewing since morning, no doubt, a salmis of woodcock, in defense of which angels would have taken up arms, buckwheat cakes in cream, flavored with aniseed, and a cheese, which is a rare thing and hardly ever to be found in Brittany, a cheese to make anyone eat a 4-pound loaf if he only smelt the rind, the whole washed down by Chambertin, and then brandy distilled by cider, which was so good that it made a man fancy that he had swallowed a deity in velvet breeches, not to mention the cigars, pure smuggled Havanas, large, strong, not dry, but green, on the contrary, which made a strong and intoxicating smoke. And how the little old gentleman stuffed and drank and smoked! He was an ogre, a chorister, a sapper, and so was I must confess, and upon my word I cannot remember what we talked about during our gargantuan feed. But we certainly talked, but what about? About shooting, certainly, and about women, most probably. Confound it! Among men, after drinking, yes, about women, I am quite sure. And he told me some funny stories, did the little old man, especially about a portrait which was hanging over the large fireplace, and which represented his grandmother, a marchioness of the old regime. She was a woman who had certainly played some pranks, and they said that she was still frisky and had good legs and thighs when she was 70. "It is extraordinary," I remarked, "how like you are to that portrait." "Yes," the old man replied with a smile, and then he added in his harsh, tremulous voice, "I resemble her in everything. I am only 60, and I feel as if I should have lusty, hot blood in me until I'm 70." And then suddenly, very much moved, and looking at me admiringly, as he had done once before, he said to the portrait, "I say, Marchioness, what a pity that you did not know this handsome young fellow." I remembered that apostrophe and that look very well, when I went to bed about an hour later, nearly drunk, in the large room papered in white and gold, to which I was shown by a tall, broad-shouldered footman, who wished me good night in Breton. Good night, yes, but that implied going to sleep, which was just what I could not do. The Chambertin, the cider brandy, and the cigars had certainly made me drunk, but not so as to overcome me altogether. On the contrary, I was excited, my nerves were highly strung, my blood was heated, and I was in a half sleep in which I felt that I was very much alive, and my whole being was in a vibration and expansion, just as if I had been smoking hashaka. Of course, that was it. I was dreaming while I was awake, but I saw the door open and the Marchioness come in, who had stepped down out of her frame. She had taken off her furbelows, and was in her nightgown. Her high headdress was replaced by a simple knot of ribbon, which confined her powdered hair into a small chignon. But I recognized her quite plainly by the trembling light of the candle which she was carrying. It was her face, with its piercing eyes, its pointed nose, and its smiling and sensual mouth. She did not look so young to me as she appeared in her portrait. Bah! Perhaps that was merely caused by the feeble, flickering light, but I had not even time to account for it, not to reflect on the strangeness of the sight, nor to discuss the matter with myself, and to say, "Am I dead drunk, or is it a ghost?" No, I had no time, and that is the fact, for the candle was suddenly blown out, and the Marchioness was in my bed and holding me in her arms, and one fixed idea, the only one that I had, haunted me, which was, had the Marchioness good limbs, and was she still frisky at 70? And I did not care much if she was 70, and if she was a ghost or not. I only thought of one thing: has she really good limbs? By Jove, yes! She did not speak. Oh, Marchioness, Marchioness! and suddenly, in spite of myself, and to convince myself that it was not a mere fantastic dream, I exclaimed, "Why, good heavens! I am not dreaming!" "No, you are not dreaming," two lips replied, trying to press themselves against mine. But oh, horror! The mouth smelt of cigars and brandy. The voice was that of the little old man. With a bound I sent him flying on to the ground, and jumped out of bed, shouting, "Beast! Beast!" Then I heard the door slam, and bare feet pattering on the stairs as he ran away. So I dressed hastily in the dark, and went downstairs, still shouting. In the hall below, where I could see through the upper windows that the dawn was breaking, I met the broad-shouldered footman, who was holding a great cudgel in his hand. He was bawling also in Breton, and pointed to the open door, outside where my dog was waiting. What could I say to this savage who did not speak French? Should I face his cudgel? There was no reason for doing so, and besides, I was even more ashamed than furious. So I hastily took up my gun and my game bag, which were in the hall, and went off without turning round. Disgusted with sport in that part of the country, I returned to Brest the same day, and there, timidly and with many precautions, I tried to find out something about the little old man. "Oh, I know," somebody replied at last to my question. "You are speaking of the manor house at Hervenidosse, where the old countess lives, who dresses like a man and sleeps with her coachman." And with a deep sigh of relief, and much to the astonishment of my informant, I replied, "Oh, so much the better." End of Section 23, recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 24 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Jeroboam. Anyone who said, or even insinuated, that the Reverend William Greenfield, vicar of St. Sampson's, Tottenham, did not make his wife Anna perfectly happy, would certainly have been very malicious. In their 12 years of married life, he had honored her with 12 children, and could anybody decently ask anything more of a saintly man? Saintly to heroism, in truth, for his wife Anna, who was endowed with invaluable virtues, which made her a model among wives and a paragon among mothers, had not been equally endowed physically, for, in one word, she was hideous. Her hair, which was coarse though it was thin, was the color of the national half and half, but of thick half and half, which looked as if it had been already swallowed several times, and her complexion, which was muddy and pimply, looked as if it were covered with sand mixed with brick dust. Her teeth, which were long and protruding, seemed as if they were about to start out of their sockets in order to escape from that mouth with scarcely any lips, whose sulphurous breath had turned them yellow. They were evidently suffering from bile. Her china blue eyes looked vaguely, one very much to the right and the other very much to the left, with a divergent and frightened squint, no doubt in order that they might not see her nose, of which they felt ashamed. And they were quite right. Thin, soft, long, pendant, sallow, and ending in a violent knob. It irresistibly reminded those who saw it of something which cannot be mentioned except in a medical treatise. Her body, through the inconceivable irony of nature, was at the same time thin and flabby, wooden and chubby, without having either the elegance of slimness or the rounded gracefulness of stoutness. It might have been taken for a body which had formerly been adipose, but which had now grown thin, while the covering had remained floating on the framework. She was, evidently, nothing but skin and bones, but then she had too many bones and too little skin. It will be seen that the reverend gentleman had done his duty, his whole duty, more than his duty, in sacrificing 12 times on this altar. Yes, 12 times, bravely and loyally, 12 times, and his wife could not deny it, nor dispute the number, because the children were there to prove it. 12 times, and not one less. And, alas, not once more. And that was the reason why, in spite of appearances, Mrs. Anna Greenfield ventured to think, in the depths of her heart, that the Reverend William Greenfield, vicar of St. Sampson's, Tottenham, had not made her perfectly happy. And she thought so all the more as, for 4 years now, she had been obliged to renounce all hope of that annual sacrifice, which was so easy and so fugitive formerly, but which had now fallen into disuse. In fact, at the birth of the 12th child, the reverend gentleman had expressly said to her, "God has greatly blessed our union, my dear Anna. We have reached the sacred number of the 12 tribes of Israel, and were we now to persevere in the works of the flesh, it would be mere debauchery, and I cannot suppose that you would wish me to end my exemplary life in lustful practices." His wife blushed and looked down, and the holy man, with the legitimate pride of virtue, which is its own reward, audibly thanked heaven that he was not as other men are. A model among wives and the paragon of mothers, Anna lived with him for 4 years on those terms, without complaining to anyone, and contented herself by praying fervently to God that he would mercifully inspire her husband with the desire to begin a second series of the 12 tribes. At times, even, in order to make her prayers more efficacious, she tried to compass that end by culinary means. She spared no pains, and gorged the reverend gentleman with highly seasoned dishes: hare soup, ox-tails stewed in sherry, the green fat in turtle soup, stewed mushrooms, Jerusalem artichokes, celery and horseradish, hot sauces, truffles, hashes with wine and cayenne pepper in them, curried lobsters, pies made of cockscombs, oysters, and the soft roe of fish. And all of these dishes were washed down by strong beer and generous wines, Scotch ale, Burgundy, dry champagne, brandy, whiskey, and gin. In a word, by that numberless array of alcoholic drinks with which the English people love to heat their blood. And as a matter of fact, the reverend gentleman's blood became very heated, as was shown by his nose and cheeks. But in spite of this, the powers above were inexorable, and he remained quite indifferent as regards his wife, who was unhappy and thoughtful at the sight of that protruding nasal appendage, which, alas, was alone in its glory. She became thinner, and at the same time flabbier than ever, and almost began to lose her trust in God, when suddenly she had an inspiration. Was it not, perhaps, the work of devil? She did not care to inquire too closely in the matter, as she thought it a very good idea, and it was this: go to the Universal Exhibition in Paris, and there, perhaps, you will discover the secret to make yourself loved. Decidedly, luck favored her, for her husband immediately gave her permission to go, and as soon as she got into the Esplanade des Invalides, she saw the Algerian dancers, and she said to herself, surely this would inspire William with the desire to be the father of the 13th tribe. But how could she manage to get him to be present at such abominable orgies? For she could not hide from herself that it was an abominable exhibition, and she knew how scandalized he would be at their voluptuous movements. She had no doubt that the devil had led her there, but she could not take her eyes off the scene, and it gave her an idea. And so, for nearly a fortnight, you might have seen the poor, unattractive woman sitting and attentively and curiously watching the swaying hips of the Algerian women. She was learning. The very evening of her return to London, she rushed into her husband's bedroom, disrobed herself in an instant, except for a thin gauze covering, and for the first time in her life appeared before him in all the ugliness of her semi-nudity. "Come, come," the saintly man stammered out. "Are you mad, Anna? What demon has possessed you? Why inflict the disgrace of such a spectacle on me?" But she did not listen to him, and did not reply, but suddenly she also began to sway her hips about, like an Alma. The reverend gentleman could not believe his eyes, and in his stupefaction he did not think of covering them with his hands, or even of shutting them. He looked at her, stupefied and dumbfounded, a prey to the hypnotism of ugliness. He watched her as she came forward and retired, and went up and down as she skipped and wriggled, and threw herself into extraordinary attitudes. For a long time he sat motionless and almost unable to speak. He only said in a low voice, "O Lord, to think that 12 times, a whole dozen!" However, she fell into a chair, panting and worn out, and said to herself, "Thank Heaven, William looks like he used to do formerly, on the days that he honored me. Thank Heaven, there will be a 13th tribe, and then a fresh series of tribes, for William is very methodical in all that he does." But William merely took a blanket off the bed and threw it over her, saying in a voice of thunder, "Your name is no longer Anna, Mrs. Greenfield. For the future you shall be called Jezebel. I only regret that I have 12 times mingled my blood with your impure blood." And then, seized by pity, he added, "If you were only in a state of inebriety, of intoxication, I could excuse you." "Well, yes, yes," she exclaimed repentantly. "Yes, I am in that state. Forgive me, William. Forgive a poor drunken woman." "I will forgive you, Anna," he replied, and he gave her a wash-hand basin, saying, "Cold water will do you good, and when your head is clear, remember the lesson which you must learn from this occurrence." "What lesson?" she asked humbly. "That people ought never to depart from their usual habits." "But why then, William," she asked timidly, "have you changed your habits?" "Hold your tongue," he cried. "Hold your tongue, Jezebel. Have you not got over your intoxication yet? For 12 years I certainly followed the divine precept, increase and multiply once a year. But since then I have grown accustomed to something else, and I do not wish to alter my habits." And the Reverend William Greenfield, vicar of St. Sampson's, Tottenham, the saintly man whose blood was inflamed by heating food and liquor, whose ears were like full-blown poppies, and who had a nose like a tomato, left his wife, and, as had been his habit for 4 years, went to make love to Polly, the servant. "Now, Polly," he said, "you are a clever girl, and I mean through you to teach Mrs. Greenfield a lesson she will never forget. I will try and see what I can do for you." And in order to do this, he called her his little Jezebel, and said to her with an unctuous smile, "Call me Jeroboam. You don't understand why? Neither do I, but that doesn't matter. Take off all your things, Polly, and show yourself to Mrs. Greenfield." The servant did as she was bidden, and the result was that Mrs. Greenfield never again hinted to her husband the desirability of laying the foundation of a 13th tribe. End of Section 24. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 25 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Log. It was a small drawing room, with thick hangings, and with a faint, judicious smell of flowers and scents about it. A large fire was burning in the grate, while one lamp covered with a shade of old lace, on the corner of the mantelpiece, threw a soft light onto the two persons who were talking. She, the mistress of the house, was an old lady with white hair, but one of those adorable old ladies whose unwrinkled skin is as smooth as the finest paper, and scented, impregnated, with perfume, as the delicate essences which she had used in her bath for so many years had penetrated through the epidermis. He was a very old friend, who had never married, a constant friend, a companion in the journey of life, but nothing else. They had not spoken for about a minute, and they were both looking at the fire, dreaming no matter of what, in one of those moments of friendly silence between people who have no need to be constantly talking in order to be happy together, when suddenly a large log, a stump covered with burning roots, fell out. It fell over the fire dogs into the drawing room, and rolled onto the carpet, scattering great sparks all round. The old lady sprang up with a little scream, as if she was going to run away, while he kicked the log back onto the hearth, and trod out all the burning sparks with his boots. When the disaster was repaired, there was a strong smell of burning, and sitting down opposite to his friend, the man looked at her with a smile and said, as he pointed to the log, "That is the reason why I never married." She looked at him in astonishment, with the inquisitive gaze of women who wish to know everything, that eye which women have who are no longer very young, in which complicated and often malicious curiosity is reflected, and she asked, "How so?" "Oh, that is a long story," he replied, "a rather sad and unpleasant story. My old friends were often surprised at the coldness which suddenly sprang up between one of my best friends, whose Christian name was Julian, and myself. They could not understand how two such intimate and inseparable friends as we had been could suddenly become almost strangers to one another, and I will tell you the reason of it. He and I used to live together at one time. We were never apart, and the friendship that united us seemed so strong that nothing could break it. One evening, when he came home, he told me that he was going to get married, and it gave me a shock, as if he had robbed me or betrayed me. When a man's friend marries, it is all over between them. The jealous affection of a woman, that suspicious, uneasy, and carnal affection, will not tolerate that sturdy and frank attachment, that attachment of the mind, of the heart, and the mutual confidence which exists between two men. You see, however great the love may be that unites them, a man and a woman are always strangers in mind and intellect. They remain belligerents, they belong to different races. There must always be a conqueror and a conquered, a master and a slave, now the one, now the other. They are never two equals. They press each other's hands, those hands trembling with amorous passion, but they never press them with a long, strong, loyal pressure, with that pressure which seems to open hearts and to lay them bare in a burst of sincere, strong, manly affection. Philosophers of old, instead of marrying and procreating children who would abandon them as a consolation for their old age, sought for a good, reliable friend, and grew old with him in that communion of thought which can only exist between men. Well, my friend Julian married. His wife was pretty, charming, a little, light, curly-haired, plump, bright woman, who seemed to worship him. And at first I went but rarely to their house, as I was afraid of interfering with their affection, and afraid of being in their way. But somehow they attracted me to their house. They were constantly inviting me, and seemed very fond of me. Consequently, by degrees, I allowed myself to be allured by the charm of their life. I often dined with them, and frequently, when I returned home at night, I thought that I would do as he had done, and get married, as I now found my empty house very dull. They seemed very much in love with one another, and were never apart. Well, one evening Julian wrote, and asked me to go to dinner, and I naturally went. "My dear fellow," he said, "I must go out directly afterwards on business, and I shall not be back until 11 o'clock, but I shall be at 11 precisely, and I reckon you to keep Bertha company." The young woman smiled. "It was my idea," she said, "to send for you." I held out my hand to her. "You are as nice as ever," I said, and I felt a long, friendly pressure of my fingers, but I paid no attention to it. So we sat down to dinner, and at 8 o'clock Julien went out. As soon as he had gone, a kind of strange embarrassment immediately seemed to arise between his wife and me. We had never been alone together yet, and in spite of our daily increasing intimacy, this tête-à-tête placed us in a new position. At first I spoke vaguely of those indifferent matters with which one fills up an embarrassing silence, but she did not reply, and remained opposite to me with her head down in an undecided manner, as if she were thinking over some difficult subject, and as I was at a loss for commonplace ideas, I held my tongue. It is surprising how hard it is at times to find anything to say. And then again, I felt in the air, I felt in the unseen, something which is impossible for me to express. That mysterious premonition which tells you beforehand of the secret intentions, be they good or evil, of another person with respect to yourself. That painful silence lasted some time, and then Bertha said to me, "Will you kindly put a log on the fire, for it is going out?" So I opened the box where the wood was kept, which was placed just where yours is, took out the largest log and put it on top of the others, which were 3 parts burnt, and then silence reigned in the room again. In a few minutes the log was burning so brightly that it scorched our faces, and the young woman raised her eyes to me, eyes that had a strange look to me. "It is too hot now," she said. "Let us go and sit on the sofa over there." So we went and sat on the sofa, and then she said suddenly, looking me full in the face, "What should you do if a woman were to tell you that she was in love with you?" "Upon my word," I replied, very much at a loss for an answer, "I cannot foresee such a case, but it would very much depend upon the woman." She gave a hard, nervous, vibrating laugh, one of those false laughs which seem as if they must break thin glasses, and then she added, "Men are never either venturesome nor acute," and after a moment's silence she continued, "Have you ever been in love, Monsieur Paul?" I was obliged to answer that I certainly had been, and she asked me to tell her all about it, whereupon I made up some story or other. She listened to me attentively, with frequent sighs of approbation and contempt, and then suddenly she said, "No, you understand nothing about the subject. It seems to me that real love must unsettle the mind, upset the nerves and distract the head, that it must, how shall I express it, be dangerous, even terrible, almost criminal and sacrilegious, that it must be a kind of treason. I mean to say that it is almost bound to break laws, fraternal bonds, sacred obstacles. When love is tranquil, easy, lawful, and without dangers, is it really love?" I did not know what answer to give her, and I made this philosophical reflection to myself: "Oh, female brain, here indeed you show yourself." While speaking, she had assumed a demure, saintly air, and resting on the cushions, she stretched herself out at full length, with her head on my shoulder and her dress pulled up a little, so as to show her red silk stockings, which the firelight made look still brighter. In a minute or two she continued, "I suppose I have frightened you." I protested against such a notion, and she leant against my breast altogether, and without looking at me, she said, "If I were to tell you that I love you, what would you do?" And before I could think of an answer, she had thrown her arms round my neck, had quickly drawn my head down and put her lips to mine. "Oh, my dear friend, I can tell you that I did not feel at all happy. What, deceive Julian? Become the lover of this little silly, wrong-headed, cunning woman, who was no doubt terribly sensual, and for whom her husband was already not sufficient? To betray him continually, to deceive him, to play at being in love merely because I was attracted by forbidden fruit, danger incurred and friendship betrayed? No, that did not suit me. But what was I to do? To imitate Joseph would be acting a very stupid and, moreover, difficult part, for this woman was maddening in her perfidy, inflamed by audacity, palpitating and excited. Let the man who has never felt on his lips the warm kiss of a woman who is ready to give herself to him throw the first stone at me. Well, a minute more, you understand what I mean. A minute more, and I should have been, no, she would have been, I beg your pardon, he would have been, when a loud noise made us both jump up. The log had fallen into the room, knocking over the fire irons and the fender, and onto the carpet which it had scorched, and had rolled under an armchair, which it would certainly set alight. I jumped up like a madman, and as I was replacing that log which had saved me on the fire, the door opened hastily, and Julian came in. "I have done," he said, in evident pleasure. "The business was over 2 hours sooner than I expected." "Yes, my dear friend, without that log, I should have been caught in the very act, and you know what the consequences would have been. You may be sure that I took good care never to be overtaken in a similar situation again. Never, never. Soon afterwards, I saw that Julian was giving me the cold shoulder, as they say. His wife was evidently undermining our friendship. By degrees, he got rid of me, and we have altogether ceased to meet. I have not got married, which ought not to surprise you, I think. End of section 25. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 26 of the works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Margot's Tapers. 1. Margot Fresquil had allowed herself to be tempted for the first time by the delicious intoxication of the mortal sin of loving on the evening of Midsummer Day. While most of the young people were holding each other's hands and dancing in a circle round the burning logs, the girl had slyly taken the deserted road which led to the wood, leaning on the arm of her partner, a tall, vigorous farm servant, whose Christian name was Tiennou, which, by the way, was the only name he had borne from his birth, for he was entered on the register of births with this curt note: "Father and mother unknown," he having been found on St. Stephen's Day, under a shed on a farm, where some poor, despairing wretch had abandoned him, perhaps even without turning her head round to look at him. For months Tiennou had madly worshipped that fair, pretty girl, who was now trembling as he clasped her in his arms, under the sweet coolness of the leaves. He rigorously remembered how she had dazzled him, like some ecstatic vision, the recollection of which always remains imprinted on the eyes, the first time that he saw her in her father's mill, where he had gone to ask for work. She stood out all rosy from the warmth of the day, amidst the impalpable clouds of flour, which diffused an indistinct whiteness through the air. With her hair hanging about her in untidy curls, as if she had just awakened from a profound sleep, she stretched herself lazily, with her bare arms clasped behind her head, and yawned so as to show her white teeth, which glistened like those of a young wolf, and her maiden nudity appeared beneath her unbuttoned bodice with innocent immodesty. He told her that he thought her adorable so stupidly that she made fun of him and scourged him with her cruel laughter, and from that day he spent his life in Margot's shadow. He might have been taken for one of those wild beasts, ardent with desire, which ceaselessly utter maddened cries to the stars on nights when the constellations bathe the dark coverts in warm light. Margot met him wherever she went, and seized with pity, and by degrees agitated by his sobs, by his dumb entreaties, by the burning looks which flashed from his large eyes, she had returned his love. She had dreamt restlessly that during a whole night she had been in his vigorous arms, which pressed her like corn that is being crushed in the mill, that she was obeying a man who had subdued her, and learning strange things, which the other girls talked about in a low voice, when they were drawing water at the well. She had, however, been obliged to wait until Midsummer Day, for the miller watched over his heiress very carefully. The two lovers told each other all this as they were going along the dark road, and innocently giving utterance to words of happiness, which rise to the lips like the forgotten refrain of a song. At times they were silent, not knowing what more to say, and not daring to embrace each other any more. The night was soft and warm, the warmth of a half-closed alcove in a bedroom, and which had the effect of a tumbler of new wine. The leaves were sleeping motionless and in supreme peace, and in the distance they could hear the monotonous sound of the brooks as they flowed over the stones. Amidst the dull noise of the insects, the nightingales were answering each other from tree to tree, and everything seemed alive with hidden life, and the sky was bright with such a shower of falling stars that they might have been taken for white forms wandering among the dark trunks of the trees. "Why have we come?" Margot asked in a panting voice. "Do you not want me any more, Tiennou?" "Alas, I dare not," he replied. "Listen, you know that I was picked up on the high road, that I have nothing in the world except my 2 arms, and that Miller Fresquil will never let his daughter marry a poor devil like me." She interrupted him with a painful gesture, and putting her lips to his, she said, "What does that matter? I love you, and I want you. Take me." And it was thus, on St. John's night, Margot Fresquil, for the first time, yielded to the mortal sin of love. 2. Did the miller guess his daughter's secret, when he heard her singing merrily from dawn till dusk, and saw her sitting, dreaming at her window, instead of sewing, as she was in the habit of doing? Did he see it when she threw ardent kisses from the tips of her fingers to her lover at a distance? However that might have been, he shut poor Margot in the mill, as if it had been a prison. No more love or pleasure, no more meetings at night at the verge of the wood. When she chatted with the passers-by, when she tried furtively to open the gate of the enclosure and to make her escape, her father beat her as if she had been some disobedient animal, until she fell on her knees on the floor with clasped hands, scarcely able to move, and her whole body covered with purple bruises. She pretended to obey him, but she revolted in her whole being, and the string of bitter insults which he heaped upon her rang in her head. With clenched hands and a gesture of terrible hatred, she cursed him for standing in the way of her love, and at night she rolled about on her bed, bit the sheets, moaned, stretched herself out for imaginary embraces, maddened by the sensual heat with which her body was still palpitating. She called out Tiennou's name aloud. She broke the peaceful stillness of the sleeping house with her heartening sobs, and her dejected voice drowned the monotonous sound of the water that was dripping under the arch of the mill, between the immovable paddles of the wheel. 3. Then there came that terrible week in October, when the unfortunate young fellows who had drawn bad numbers had to join their regiments. Tiennou was one of them, and Margot was in despair to think that she should not see him for 5 interminable years, that they could not even at that hour of sad farewells be alone and exchange those consoling words which afterwards alleviate the pain of absence. Tiennou prowled about the house like a starving beggar, and one morning, while the miller was mending the wheel, he managed to see Margot, "I will wait for you in the old place tonight," he whispered, in terrible grief. "I know it is the last time. I shall throw myself into some deep hole in the river if you do not come." "I will be there, Tiennou," she replied, in a bewildered manner. "I swear I will be there, even if I have to do something terrible to enable me to come." The village was burning in the dark night, and the flames, fanned by the wind, rose up like sinister torches. The thatched roofs, the ricks of corn, the haystacks and the barns fell in, and crackled like rockets, while the sky looked as if they were illuminated by an aurora borealis. Fresquyl's mill was smoking, and its calcined ruins were reflected on the deep water. The sheep and cows were running about the fields in terror, the dogs were howling, and the women were sitting on the broken furniture, and were crying and wringing their hands, while during all this time Margot was abandoning herself to her lover's ardent caresses, and with her arms round his neck, she said to him tenderly: "You see that I have kept my promise. I set fire to the mill so that I might be able to get out. So much the worse if all have suffered, but I do not care, as long as you are happy in having me and love me." And pointing to the fire, which was still burning fiercely in the distance, she added with a burst of savage laughter: "Tiennou, we shall not have such beautiful tapers at our wedding mass, when you come back from your regiment." And thus it was that for the second time Margot Fresquyle yielded to the mortal sin of love. End of section 26. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Section 27 of the works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Caught in the very act. "It is certain," Sulpice de Laurier said, "that I had absolutely forgotten the date on which I was to allow myself to be taken in the very act with a mistress for the occasion, as neither my wife nor I had any serious nor plausible reason for a divorce, not even the simplest incompatibility of temper, and as there is always a risk of not softening the heart of even the most indulgent judge when he is told that the parties have agreed to drag their load separately, each for themselves, that they are too frisky, too fond of pleasure and of wandering about from place to place to continue the conjugal experiment, we between us got up the ingenious stage arrangement of a serious wrong. This was funnier than all the rest, and under any other circumstances it would have been repugnant to me to mix up our servants in the affair like so many others do, or to distress that pretty little fair and delicate Parisian woman, even though it were only in appearance, and to pass as a common ganarelle, with the manners of a carter, in the eyes of some scoundrel of a footman or of some lady's maid. And so, when Maître Le Chevrier, that kind lawyer who certainly knows more female secrets than the most fashionable confessor, gave a startled exclamation on seeing me still in my dressing gown, and slowly smoking a cigar like an idler who has no engagements down on his tablets, and who is quietly waiting for the usual time for dressing and going to dine at his club, he exclaimed: "Have you forgotten that this is the day at the Hôtel des Bades between 5 and 6 o'clock? In an hour, Madame de Laurier will be at the office of the police commissary in the Rue de Provence, with her uncle and Maître Cantenac. An hour! I only had an hour, 60 short minutes to dress in, to take a room, find a woman, and persuade her to go with me immediately, and to excite her feelings so that this extravagant adventure might not appear too equivocal to the commissary of police. 1 hour in which to carry out such a programme was enough to make a man lose his head, and there were no possible means of putting off that obligatory entertainment, to let Madame de Laurier know in time, and to gain a few minutes more. Have you found a woman, at any rate?" Maître de Chevrier continued anxiously. "No, my dear sir." I immediately began to think of the whole string of my dear female friends. Should I choose Liline Ablette, who could refuse me nothing? Blanche Rebus, who was the best comrade a man ever had? Or Lalie Spring, that luxurious creature who was constantly in search of something new? Neither one nor the other of them, for it was 99 chances to 1 that all these confounded girls were in the Bois de Boulogne, or at their dressmakers'. Bah! Just pick up the first girl you meet on the pavement. And before the hour was up, I was bolting the door of a room which looked out onto the boulevard. The woman whom I had picked up, as she was walking past the cafés from the Vaudeville to Tortoni's, was 20 at the most. She had an impudent snub nose, as if it had been turned up in fun by a fillip, large eyes with deep rims round them. Her lips were too red, and she had the slow, indolent walk of a girl who goes in for debauchery too freely, and who began too soon. But she was pretty, and her linen was very clean and neat, and she was evidently used to chance love making, and had a way of undressing herself in 2 or 3 rapid movements, of throwing her toggery to the right and left until she was extremely lightly clad, and of throwing herself onto the bed, which astonished me as a sight that was well worth seeing. She did not talk much, though she began by saying: "Pay up at once, old man. You don't look like a fellow who would bilk a girl, but it puts me into better trim when I have been paid." I gave her 2 napoleons, and she eyed me with gratitude and respect at the same time, but also with that uneasy look of a girl who asks herself, "What does this tool expect for it?" The whole affair began to amuse me, and I must confess that I was rather taken with her, for she had a beautiful figure and complexion, and I was hoping that the commissary would not come directly, when there was a loud rapping at the door. She sat up with a start, and grew so pale that one would have said she was about to faint. "What a set of pigs, to come and interrupt people like this!" she muttered between her teeth, while I affected the most complete calm. "Somebody who has made a mistake in the room, my dear," I said. But this noise increased, and suddenly I heard a man's voice saying clearly and authoritatively: "Open the door in the name of the law." On hearing that, one would have thought that she had received a shock from an electric battery, by the nimble manner in which she jumped out of bed, and quickly putting on her stays and her dress anyhow, she endeavored to discover a way out in every corner of the room, like a wild beast trying to escape from its cage. I thought that she was going to throw herself out of the window, so I seized hold of her to prevent her. The unfortunate creature acted like a mad woman, and when she felt my arm round her waist, she cried in a hoarse voice: "I see it, you have sold me. You thought that I should expose myself. Oh, you filthy brutes! You filthy brutes!" And suddenly, passing from abuse to entreaties, pale and with chattering teeth, she threw herself at my feet, and said in a low voice: "Listen to me, my dear. You don't look a bad sort of fellow, and you would not like them to lock me up. I have a kid and the old woman to keep. Hide me behind the bed, do, and please don't give me up. I will make it up to you, and you shall have no cause for grumbling." At that moment, however, the lock which they had unscrewed fell onto the floor with a metallic sound, and Madame de Laurière and the police commissary, wearing his tricolored scarf, appeared in the door, while behind them the heads of the uncle and of the lawyer could be seen indistinctly in the background. The girl had uttered a cry of terror, and going up to the commissary, she said, panting: "I swear to you that I am not guilty, that I was not. I will tell you everything if you will promise me not to tell them that I split, for they would pay me out." The commissary, who was surprised, but who guessed that there was something which was not quite clear behind all this, forgot to draw up his report, and so the lawyer went up to him and said: "Well, monsieur, what are we waiting for?" But he paid no attention to anything but the woman, and looking at her sharply and suspiciously through his gold-rimmed spectacles, he said to her in a hard voice, "Your names and surnames?" "Juliet Randall, or as I am generally called, Jujute Pipehead." "So you will swear you were not—" She interrupted him eagerly. "I swear it, monsieur. I know that my little man had nothing to do with it either. He was only keeping a lookout while the others collared the swag. I will swear that I can account for every moment of my time that night. Roquin was drunk, and told me everything. They got 5,000 francs from Daddy Zacharias, and of course Roquin had his share, but he did not work with his partners. It was Mignon Menilmouche, whom they call Drink Without Thirst, who held the gardener's hands, and who bled him with a blow from his knife." The commissary let her run on, and when she had finished, he questioned me as if I had belonged to Jujute's band. "Your name, Christian name and profession?" "Marquis Sulpice de Laurier, living on my own private income at 24 Rue de Galilee." "De Laurier? Oh, very well. Excuse me, monsieur, but at Madame de Laurier's request, I declare formally before these gentlemen, who will be able to give evidence, that the girl Juliette Randall, whom they call Jujute Tête de Pipe, is your mistress. You are at liberty to go, Monsieur le Marquis. And you, girl Randall, answer my questions." Thus, by the most extraordinary chance, our divorce suit created a sensation which I had certainly never foreseen. I was obliged to appear in the Assize Court, as a witness in the celebrated case of those burglars, when 3 of them were condemned to death, and to undergo the questioning of the idiotic presiding judge, who tried by all means in his power to make me acknowledge that I was Jujute Tête de Pipe's regular lover. And in consequence, ever since then, I have passed as an ardent seeker after novel sensations, and a man who wallows in the lowest depths of the Parisian dunghill. I cannot say that this unjust reputation has brought me any pleasant love affairs. Women are so perverse, so absurd, and so curious. End of Section 27. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 28 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Confession. Monsieur de Champdelin had no reason to complain of his lot as a married man, nor could he accuse destiny of having played him in a bad turn, as it does so many others. For it would have been difficult to find a more desirable, merrier, prettier little woman, or one who was easier to amuse and to guide, than his wife. To see the large, limpid eyes which illuminated her fair, girlish face, one would think that her mother must have spent whole nights before her birth in looking dreamily at the stars, and so had become, as it were, impregnated with their magic brightness. And one did not know which to prefer, her bright silky hair, or her slightly retroussé nose, with its vibrating nostrils, her red lips, which looked as alluring as a ripe peach, her beautiful shoulders, her delicate ears, which resembled mother of pearl, or her slim waist and rounded figure, which would have delighted and tempted a sculptor. And then she was always merry, overflowing with youth and life, never dissatisfied, only wishing to enjoy herself, to laugh, to love and be loved, and putting all the house into a tumult, as if it had been a great cage full of birds. In spite of all this, however, that worn-out fool Champdelin had never cared much about her, but had left that charming garden lying waste, and almost immediately after their honeymoon, he had resumed his usual bachelor habits, and had begun to lead the same fast life that he had done of old. It was stronger than he, for he was one of those libertine natures which are constant targets for love, and which never resign themselves to domestic peace and happiness. The last woman who came across him in a love adventure was always the one whom he loved best, and the mere contact with a petticoat inflamed him, and made him commit the most imprudent actions. As he was not hard to please, he fished, as it were, in troubled waters, went after the ugly ones and the pretty ones alike, was bold even to impudence, was not to be kept off by mistakes, nor anger, nor modesty, nor threats, though he sometimes fell into a trap, and got a thrashing by some relative or jealous lover. He withstood all attempts to get hush money out of him, and became only all the more enamored of vice and more ardent in his lures and pursuit of love affairs on that account. But the work girls and the shop girls and all the tradesmen's wives in Saint Martéjou knew him, and made him pay for their whims and their coquetry, and had to put up with his love-making. Many of them smiled or blushed when they saw him under the tall plane trees in the public garden, or met him in the unfrequented, narrow streets near the cathedral, with his thin, sensual face, whose looks had something satyr-like about them, and some of them used to laugh at him and make fun of him, though they ran away when he went up to them. And when some friend or other, who was sorry that he could forget himself so far, used to say to him, when he was at a loss for any other argument, "And your wife, Champdelin, are you not afraid that she will have her revenge and pay you out in your own coin?" his only reply was a contemptuous and incredulous shrug of the shoulders. She deceive him? Indeed! She, who was as devout, as virtuous, and as ignorant of forbidden things as a nun, who cared no more for love than she did for an old slipper? She, who did not even venture on any veiled illusions, who was always laughing, who took life as it came, who performed her religious duties with edifying assiduity, she to pay him back, so as to make him look ridiculous, and to gad about at night? Never! Anyone who could think such a thing must have lost his senses. However, one summer day, when the roofs all seemed red hot, and the whole town appeared dead, Monsieur de Champdelin had followed two milliners' girls, with bandboxes in their hands, from street to street, whispering nonsense to them, and promising beforehand to give them anything they asked him for, and had gone after them as far as the cathedral. In their fright, they took refuge there, but he followed them in, and, emboldened by the solitude of the nave and by the perfect silence in the building, he became more enterprising and bolder. They did not know how to defend themselves, or to escape from him, and were trembling at his daring attempts and at his kisses, when he saw a confessional whose doors were open, in one of the side chapels. "We should be much more comfortable in there, my little dears," he said, going into it, as if to get such an unexpected nest ready for them. But they were quicker than he, and throwing themselves against the grated door, they pushed it to before he could turn round, and locked him in. At first he thought it was only a joke, and it amused him, but when they began to laugh heartily, and putting their tongues at him, as if he had been a monkey in a cage, and overwhelmed him with insults, he first of all grew angry, and then humble, offering to pay well for his ransom, and he implored them to let him out, and tried to escape like a mouse does out of a trap. They, however, did not appear to hear him, but naively bowed to him ceremoniously, wished him good night, and ran out as fast as they could. Champdelin was in despair. He did not know what to do, and cursed his bad luck. What would be the end of it? Who would deliver him from that species of prison? And was he going to remain there all the afternoon and night, like a portmanteau that had been forgotten at the lost luggage office? He could not manage to force the lock, and did not venture to knock hard against the sides of the confessional, for fear of attracting the attention of some beadle or sacristan. Oh, those wretched girls! And how people would make fun of him, and write verses about him, and point their fingers at him, if the joke were discovered, and got noised abroad. By and by he heard the faint sound of prayers in the distance, and through the green serge curtain that concealed him, Monsieur Champdelin heard the rattle of the beads on the chaplets, as the women repeated their Ave Marias, and the rustle of dresses, and the noise of footsteps on the pavement. Suddenly he felt a tickling in his throat that nearly choked him, and he could not altogether prevent himself from coughing. and when at last it passed off, the unfortunate man was horrified at hearing someone come into the chapel and up to the confessional. Whoever it was knelt down and gave a discreet knock at the grating which separated the priest from his penitents. So he quickly put on the surplice and stole which were hanging on a nail, and covering his face with his handkerchief and sitting back in the shade, he opened the grating. It was a woman who was already saying her prayers, and he gave the responses as well as he could, from his boyish recollections, and was somewhat agitated by the delicious scent that emanated from her half-raised veil and from her bodice. But at her first words he started so that he almost fainted. He had recognized his wife's voice, and it felt to him as if his seat were studded with sharp nails, that the sides of the confessional were closing in on him, and as if the air were growing rarefied. He now collected himself, however, and regaining his self-possession, he listened to what she had to say with increasing curiosity, and with some uncertain and necessary interruptions. The young woman sighed, was evidently keeping back something, spoke about her unhappiness, her melancholy life, her husband's neglect, the temptations by which she was surrounded, and which she found it so difficult to resist. Her conscience seemed to be burdened by an intolerable weight, though she hesitated to accuse herself directly. And in a low voice, with unctuous and coaxing tones, and mastering himself, Champdelin said, "Courage, my child, tell me everything. The divine mercy is infinite. Tell me all without hesitation." Then, all at once, she told him everything that was troubling her, how passion and desire had thrown her into the arms of one of her husband's best friends, the exquisite happiness that they felt when they met every day, his delightful tenderness, which she could no longer resist, the sin which was her joy, her only object, her consolation, her dream. She grew excited, sobbed, seemed enervated and worn out, as if she were still burning from her lover's kisses, hardly seemed to know what she was saying, and begged for temporary absolution from her sins. But then Champdelin, in his exasperation, and unable to restrain himself any longer, interrupted her in a furious voice. "Oh no, oh no, this is not at all funny. Keep such sort of things to yourself, my dear." Poor little Madame de Champdelin nearly went out of her mind with fright and astonishment, and they are now waiting for the decree which will break their chains and let them part. End of Section 28. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.